I'm Eric James Stone. I've had about 50 short stories published in various places, including Analog Magazine and the scientific journal Nature. I won a Nebula Award a few years ago for one of my stories, and my first novel came out from Baen a couple of years ago.
I don't think I need this. My name is Peter Orullian. I'm in the middle of an epic fantasy series with Tor. I'm really proud. Recently, I did a novelization of a concept album by the band Dream Theater, who is my favorite band of all time. And I just last month and a half ago, announced Brandon Sanderson and I are collaborating on a new urban fantasy series. So that's where most of my writing time is going right now.
I'll take this, I'm not very loud. I'm Shannen Camp. I write kind of everywhere. Like, I have dystopian and paranormal romance and all sorts of things in young adult and new adult. I've got 13 books out right now, and I write for a gaming website called svg.com, and I stream on, well, I did stream on Twitch. Now I'm mostly on YouTube as Persephone Plasmids, because I'm a giant dork. The end.
I'm Emily R. King. I write young adult fantasy. My first series is The 100th Queen, which is The Bachelor meets The Hunger Games. And my second series is The Evermore Chronicles. Book one comes out in June. It's about a girl with a clock heart. Is that it?
All right, so to start off, do you have any examples, either from your own work or from someone else, of something that was foreshadowed, that you felt was foreshadowed really well? I'll go first with an example from one of my stories, and it's an example of something that I foreshadowed accidentally, because I didn't know what was going to come later, and it inspired what happened later, and so the foreshadowing was already there. Sometimes you have to do it the other way around, figure out how you're going to hint at what's happened later. But I have a short story in which people could have backups of themselves and can be downloaded into new bodies very easily, and they're filming a movie, and the main action star plummets to his death on film during filming, and so they just reboot him and bring him back, and so I had just thrown it in as a funny little thing that he falls screaming to his death, but it doesn't really matter because he can just be brought back to life. Later on, a key plot point involves someone blocking them from doing something because he hates this action star. And so the second assistant director on the movie says, hey, I have footage of him falling screaming to his death, and uses that to bribe the guy to let them do what they want to do. So it worked out perfectly for me, but why I think it's a good example of a way you can foreshadow without giving it away is that when it was, the part that was there foreshadowing was actually, working as a joke within the context of the story, and so nobody would think, oh, that obviously is going to come up later, which is the problem we tend to have with the whole Chekhov's gun thing, if you're familiar with that. The idea that if you have a gun on the mantle in the first act, in the second act, the gun has to go off. And readers get wise to that, and so if you have something in there that doesn't seem to have any purpose, they go, oh, that must be a Chekhov's gun, and they start to suspect it. So if you have another purpose for putting in your bit of foreshadowing, that can help to hide the fact that you're foreshadowing something else.
Rather than just go to a direct example, it kind of occurs to me as I thinking about the topic, listening to you speak, that there's different ways we might want to use foreshadowing. I think that you can run a risk of being so subtle that it's not really foreshadowing. If you decide that the effect you want is a moment later in the book when something happens, someone thinks, that other thing happened earlier, that's legitimate. A lot of the foreshadowing that I've been doing lately I'm sorry to invoke this, but this is what Brandon does a lot, is he talks about hanging a lantern on it. Like that, so it's really, really clear that you're foreshadowing, because sometimes the subtlety is not going to have the desired effect. So as an example then there's in the work I'm working on now, there's a lot to do with this mechanic of steps that go down, and I can't kind of tell you why. But we made a big deal of the moment in time early in the book when the character sees these steps and consciously wonders about where they go and has some idea about it. And we hang a lantern on it because we want the reader to note that this has some meaning, and that meaning is enigmatic now, but then when the thing happens later, it's really clear how you've connected the dots. And that's not the only way to do it. I'm not even saying it's the best way to do it, but I think that there's sort of shades of subtlety. And on the one end, you risk it not really having a lot of resonance when the later moment happens. On the other hand, you can go too far. Like you can kind of spill everything early and then lose a little bit of the mystique that happens later. And that calibration is probably a little bit about what this panel is about. But I would just advise you, in my first novel, the thing that happens with writers is because you know everything, I think you err on the side of subtlety. Oh, I can't make it too clear. They're just going to figure everything out. But you have to recognize you know everything. So there's a little bit of this idea of hanging a lantern on it to make sure that the reader pays enough attention that maybe there can be some real payoff when your moment later in the book comes.
I have a book series where one of the characters, everything that they do is motivated by this twist that doesn't pay off until the third book. But if you end up going back and looking at the character, it's really, really obvious after you learn about it. But one of the things that I actually really like recently, and I'm sorry if you've been to any of my other panels, all my examples are video games. I'm a terrible author. But I just recently played this video game that it used foreshadowing in a way that they distracted you with something else while still giving you these clues that if you had been paying attention, it would have been obvious. It's this really cute pastel pink, everything is cute game. And one of the characters keeps hinting that they're really depressed, but it's really not what you're focusing on because you're blinded by the pastel pink cotton candy of everything else. And it ends up being this really big plot point later on. But I like that idea of presenting the reader with two things to look at, and one of them is a bit more distracting. So it's not even that the foreshadowing is too subtle. It's just that any, I guess, normal person, well, I'm not that normal, so I don't know. Maybe normal person is going to pay attention to this cotton candy over here while there's this darker undertone going on the side. Sorry about the video game references.
Who here reads mystery? Okay, so you're the people who know the ending of a movie before it's over, right? For the most part. Okay, if you read enough mysteries, you get an idea of who it is, the who've done it, the beginning. You get a feeling for it. And one of the most common tools in mystery is distraction. And I actually think that lying is a really great form of foreshadowing. You're having a character who lies about something, and then their actions don't meet their words, so you're not totally sure which one's true, especially if they've convinced other people that the lie might be true. It gives some credence to it, and you're not entirely certain, which is basically all that mystery and a lot of crime suspense is putting in enough distractions to keep your eye away from who really did it and who's really the one. So lying is a good way. But as far as planting seeds and foreshadowing, the first thing that came to me was the Hunger Games. So they talk about District 13 in the second book, about how it was bombed and destroyed. And am I going to spoil this for anybody? Everybody's read this, right? Okay.
Earmuffs if you haven't.
Yeah, but this was your warning. So at the end of book 2, when they're whisked away and they're taken somewhere secret, it of course ends up being District 13, right? That was bombed. So the foreshadowing was the exact opposite of what it is, but when they ended up in District 13, you were like, oh, so that wasn't true that you told us. But they got the information across that it existed, or it once existed, and that nobody goes there anymore. So you can give a bit of the truth and then wrap it in a lie in a couple lies to distract your reader from not knowing what the truth and what the lie would be. So it's not as, oh, I know what's coming. There's the gun on the mantelpiece. Someone's gonna fire it. It's buried underneath. That little nugget of truth is buried. And when you start to write, you may not know which nugget of truth it is until you get to that point. I don't know if Suzanne Collins just whisked them out and was like, okay, I gotta put them somewhere, so we're gonna put them in the one place nobody knows anything about. She may not have planned it, she just might have, that's where it was, that's what she had to work with.
Okay, so let's look at the process of setting things up for a later payoff. And I don't know whether you're outliners or pantsers. It seems to me like outliners probably know, since they know how it's all going to end and everything, they can be putting in foreshadowing during the course of writing everything. Do pantsers, because I'm an outliner, I don't know how pantsers do it. Do pantsers, finish the book and then go back and plug in foreshadowing for what comes later? How do your processes work?
I haven't done as much pantsing in recent years, but I've talked to a lot of writers who do, and I kind of hear two things from them. One is there's the pantser who's really instinctive, and they're able to introduce things that they sort of instinct from a narrative instinct they know is going to pay dividends later. The great thing with the tools we have now is it's easy to go back and massage and manipulate that. But the other thing I hear is the second piece, which is once they get to the ending, a pantser, and they see the kinds of things that they want to start cluing their reader in, it's easy to go back earlier in the manuscript and introduce them. Because I don't do that very much pantsing anymore, I will very deliberately have places where I'm going to introduce something that I want the reader to know, and I want them to, I don't tell them what's going to happen, of course, and so maybe this is the shadowy part, but it's pretty, the way I use foreshadowing is it's pretty clear that this thing's going to matter later. And so then the fun can be how you manipulate the reader in thinking what that's going to be as the novel progresses. And they can start to think that it's one thing. You can sort of misdirect and have the payoff be the foreshadowing payoff in a completely different way. I really like the lie thing a lot. I think that's and what I got thinking about as you were talking is, you may do multiple kinds of foreshadowing. So you may have some where a reader gets a really clear idea of something because you do pay off some of these more obvious things that you're going to do callbacks on. But then you have some that are wrapped in lies and mystery so that the reader can start to get this false sense of security that they got it figured out because the techniques you're using multiple techniques. So I've never lied to my readers like that. I'm going to have to try it.
It's fun. I used to not be much of a plotter, but I got in trouble a lot with that in my books by like changing eye colors for characters randomly and things like that. So now I am a big time plotter. And usually when I get ideas for books, a lot of the time the idea is the ending for the book. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that would be just such a cool reveal. What if this happened? And so because of that, when I'm writing, I'm like, okay, what would be really mean of me? Like, what can I put in there that if you read it, you would just be like, oh, this is a normal character trait, that's fine. And then if you like finish the book, you'll go back and be like, oh, it was right there, all the clues. So I'm kind of a mean author because I like to think of what I can put in there that once you know it is super obvious, but otherwise seems like a normal thing. I guess that's a jerk move. I don't know. I know we said don't be too subtle, but there you go. But yes, I know at the beginning of the story, at the beginning of my writing process, what's going to happen, because I feel like the times that I've gone back afterwards and like added things in, usually you can tell that I've gone back and added things in. Maybe that just means I'm not a good enough writer. But yeah, I like to know ahead of time where I need to put the foreshadowing in before I finish the story.
Oh man, I kind of hate and love foreshadowing. It's so much work. If you write a series, anybody here write a series? Do series? Okay. Do you like reading series? Yes, okay. Continuity is one of the biggest things that's really hard about a series. Because you'd think that we would remember everything in book one, but we don't. I have to go back and flip through things. I don't know what color I gave so-and-so. Story Bibles are a really good tool for that. I know that they take time. I actually taught a class on it. They take a lot of time up front, but they're a good way to make sure that you're keeping those, like, the minutia straight. But when it comes to foreshadowing a series, you kind of have to know the end to know how to foreshadow in the beginning. And depending on how long the series is, that can get kind of complicated. And what I've learned with mine is that once I know the ending, I want to tell my reader everything. And I want to put it all up front, and I want you to know everything. And then I have to go back and edit, like, most of that out and sprinkle it throughout so that I'm not giving everything away. And that's just me and my craft and what I've learned. So it can be helpful when you don't know and when you discover it in your pantser along the way, maybe, because you're not so tempted to, like when I outline, to put it all up front and spoil it for my readers. So something to watch in your writing. If you're taking all the mystery out of things, or if you're putting too much in, your reader's getting lost, then you should probably start to self-edit that a little bit and save some things for later. You may not need everything. You might need more. That's what beta readers are for. Mm-hmm. I know that's not helpful at all, I'm sorry.
Okay, let's leave the microphone down at that end to mix things up a bit. So the next thing is there's a phrase I've heard often, surprising yet inevitable, when talking about the ending of a book or a movie. So what can you do to make the ending surprising and yet inevitable?
Just think of something brilliant right now.
I'm trying to think of like movies and books where I've been disappointed. You know, when you kind of like within 15 minutes you know how it's going to end, kind of thing. I think we've all read or seen those. Oh, okay, yeah, all right. So I read a YA fantasy. It was really good, but I knew at the beginning of chapter 1 that this girl who didn't know that she was a queen was actually a queen and she had powers. I mean, it was before the end of the first chapter. I already knew where this book was going. The setup was so blatant in the first chapter that I just lost interest. Now, if I wanted to just find out if I was right, I probably would have finished the novel. But it was so in my face about what I could expect from this character that it overwhelmed the character. I wasn't seeing a character anymore. I was seeing an arc line and where the story was going. So maybe you could say that was too much telling and not enough showing. You could say it's too much showing and not enough telling. I don't know. But there is a fine balance between making it too clear of a wrap up what your character wants. So if they've told you my ideal dream is this one thing, and you know that they're probably going to get it, maybe is that a romance when they end up together? Is that like, do you know? But isn't like the formula for a romance a happy ending? Yeah. Like you have to. Okay, so how do you guys deal with it? You read romances. I guess it really depends on your reader's expectations and what you write. That's what I would say, genre, and then the expectations that you set, because whatever the promise of your premise is, whatever you've guaranteed your readers in the beginning, is what you've got to fulfill in the end. So my first series, I got to the end of book 3, and my love interest did not end up with my main character. And I realized I had to write an entire book so that my readers would get them to be together, because I promised them in the beginning that they would be, and I was going to have a lot of very upset people if I didn't fulfill that promise. So yes, it was expected that that was the ending, but it took one more book longer than they thought, which was either good or bad. I'm very sorry if you're one of my readers. I really enjoyed doing that to you, I have to say.
So you are mean. Okay.
I am mean.
Good. I'm not alone. I like going from the ending of a plot or the ending of a book and kind of working backwards. So if you know where it is that you want to go and you need that to be like, oh, it was inevitable, but you don't want it to be too obvious. It's like you know what the solution is going to be, and you kind of eliminate other possible solutions along the way. So that by the time it happens, it's like, oh, wait a minute, you're right. This is how this story had to end. Like it's sudden but inevitable. So yeah, I like to start at the end and then think, okay, this is where I want the book to end. This is all the possible ways that this story could end. And we're not talking BioShock Infinite with like a million endings. but like this is the one ending that it needs to be. So I'm going to make it so that as the story progresses, I'm going to eliminate the possibility of these other endings being like a viable candidate, I guess.
Example that came to my mind, which is a favorite book and film, well, it's not a book, it's a novella, is The Shawshank Redemption. You don't know that if you see the movie poster, which maybe gives it away, which kind of sucks, but it's a prison break story, and it's a prison break film, but very unconventional. If you've seen the film, they do a really, Frank Darabont, who did the screenplay, does a fantastic job of showing you, once they discover, the warden discovers the hole that he's been digging for 20 years, they go back and they do some little flashback scenes to show you what he's been doing. But the foreshadowing's there. He does get the rock hammer, but they make a joke about it, because he says to Red, he says, you're going to try and tunnel out of here. And he kind of laughs and he says, well, just wait till you see the rock hammer. And Red makes this joke. He says, I finally got the joke. It'd take man 600 years to tunnel out of here with this thing. So you pull it out of your mind. Okay, well, he's not going to try. And then throughout the story, there are these moments when it's clear that he is, what does he say? He's his wings, his feathers were just too bright. There's the moment where he plays the aria, the Mozart aria for all of the prisoners. And there's this moment of hope. And he actually goes to the hole for a month. Actually spends 2 months. And when he comes back and he tells the guys, easiest time I ever did. I had Mozart with me the whole time. And they say, what are you talking about? And he says, hope. And then, everybody tells him, well, that hope's a dangerous thing, blah, blah, blah. There's the other moment where he risks life to get them all a beer while they're tarring the roof of the plate shop. And all he wanted was a moment to feel free again. And he says, we sat drinking beer with the sun on our backs and felt like free men. There are all of these clues throughout there that Andy doesn't belong in prison. He's got a free heart. He has hope. Yet there are other things that happen along the way that frustrate this. Brooks kills himself. He becomes an institutional man. And everybody's all spun up about it. Red says the same thing about himself. And there's this beautiful series, if you've seen the film, where Red goes in for his parole hearings, and he has this rote thing that he's written and memorized that he thinks is what they want to hear. And the last one, he delivers it, and he's a broken man. He says, stop wasting my time, you're not letting me out of here. So Red becomes this counterpoint to Andy, who does get free. So there's all of this kind of really interesting foreshadowing that takes place, and then all of a sudden he's free. And all of the clues were there that he didn't belong there, and that of course he could and would do this, but it was never his driving thing throughout. All of this time he was learning how to live in prison. And by the way, it's one of my favorite films of all time. If you haven't seen it, it works on so many thematic levels that it's a shame if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I want to bring up a favorite example as well. And I hope I don't need a spoiler warning for Lord of the Rings. But when you look at the climax on Mount Doom, we've known all along that the ring corrupts and that the ring holders get controlled by the ring, and so when Frodo, who we've been following, expecting him to throw the ring in this whole time, says, no, I'm keeping it. I mean, that was surprising, but inevitable based on the foreshadowing that had been set up there. But we also have Gollum, who we know will never give up until he can get that ring back. And that's how those two paths come together, and the climax there is surprising, but it was inevitable based on the characters and the ring. All right. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'd like to open it up for questions. So that everybody can hear, it's best if when you're called on, you stand up and say your question as loudly as possible, and maybe I'll repeat it back so that everyone in the audience can hear. Yes?
They still can't see me because I'm just that little. So the thing that I'm struggling with the specific story when it comes to foreshadowing is I still want this certain reveal to be a surprise, but if I don't hint at it sufficiently enough, it's gonna come way out of left field. But if I do it badly, I guess, then I'm gonna have the opposite problem of it being too obvious of an answer. So how do I find a good middle ground of not coming out of left field, but not being one of those things where as soon as a hint is dropped, somebody's like, oh, this is gonna happen.
Okay. Anyone want to handle that one first?
I mean, I could take a crack at it. So it'd be a lot easier if we knew specifics, obviously, but we're like being very hush-hush here. So I think maybe the best thing to do in that situation without knowing what it is you're talking about is to, I guess, like find a unique, I know this sounds obvious, find a unique way to foreshadow. But I mean, instead of like, okay, this is what it is if I'm keeping it quiet, this is what it is if I'm dropping like hints about it. Instead, find a different, like if it's a personality, or like if it's a person who ends up being, you know, evil and you don't want people to know that they're evil the whole time. Dropping different hints than you would normally see in that kind of a twist. Like instead of like, oh, they keep having these secret meetings, or like, oh, they like sometimes they say things and they don't actually follow through on them. You know, finding different maybe ways to show that, like a personality trait, or I guess something like that. That's not making much sense now that I'm saying it, but you know, like finding the middle ground of this is not something that would usually be foreshadowing, but because you don't want to be too on the nose and you don't want to be too vague, then you need to find like something that's, okay, now I sound like I don't know what I'm talking about. It makes sense in my head, okay? This is why I'm a writer.
I'm gonna riff here. I would go back to your characters. A lot of the time, the thing that you are trying to hide, it's hiding through your characters, or not hiding through your characters. So if your main character doesn't know something, but everyone around them does, it's not going to take very long before they figure it out, right? Especially considering that people like to talk. So, and they're talking to other characters, so eventually something will come out. But if the information is either not known or not widely accepted or is wrong, misdirect, it's still said, still stated, but your reader will get the impression that it's not true. So it's a good way to hide. I mean, I'm talking about lying again. I think you guys probably think I just lie all the time. But it is the most effective way. And the worst part about that is that you get to the point where you don't know if it's a lie or not. And that's what makes it so good. Is that if you give enough information, if you have your characters talk so much that you don't know what is true and what isn't, then they're not going to cling to one thing, the thing you're trying to hide. Oh, I would go back and look and see what your character knows and where they're learning it from, and wherever they do learn it from, hide it. Hide it in that source, somehow.
It's like 2 Truths and a Lie book edition.
I know.
I like it. This is good. I don't want
Is
this.
that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
You.
Everybody just lie.
Do you ever drop fake hints? Like ones that, are a little bit obvious, so you drop them on purpose so they think it's gonna happen, but it doesn't?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's referred to as red herrings.
Yes.
And yes, I was going to actually suggest that as a possibility in your story. To have some red herrings, things that will make people go, oh,
Don't give me that.
that's where this story is going. I know where this story is going now, but that distracts from the real herring, I guess.
The blue herring.
Real herring. I've never heard that in any panel ever. That's awesome. The real herring. We gotta write that story.
Right? That is great.
Okay, yes.
So going off the red herring thing, when you read like so many books after a while, I don't know, like for me, whenever something like a red herring pops up, I'm like, oh, this is totally to throw you off of what's actually happening. So you look for it and you can still predict what actually happened. So I guess the question is, how do you make like a good red herring? Something that doesn't look, oh, this is just to distract you from what's really happening and could like possibly be.
I think you just have to have some that pay off. If you have some that pay off and some that don't, then your reader's a little off balance. If everything you do pays off, then maybe you're telegraphing too much. I go back to the thing I said up top, though. If you're worried about being too subtle or too explicit, you might have a couple of beta readers read it and see. I think a lot of times it's so transparent to us as writers because we know everything. So have a reader corroborate your instinct and see before you do too much work. But I think if you're writing the kind of story where you feel like you want some misdirection, doing some foreshadowing that actually pays off and some that doesn't, then your reader's off balance. They won't know what to follow, right? So just don't be too unilateral.
Let me preface this by saying I do read books. So there's this video game where your character, thank you, where your character is getting tips from somewhere, and sometimes they end up being true. Like sometimes it'll be like, oh my gosh, there's something behind you, you need to turn around, and so you'll do that, and it's like, oh, this thing just saved your life. Other times it'll say the same thing and there's nothing there. So I think kind of going along with that, just like if you have red herrings that sometimes will pay off, then it's not really a red herring anymore.
It's a real herring.
It's a blue herring, yes.
That's such an oxymoron. I love it. I'm good.
Okay, in the back there.
Yeah. So regarding, so in a lot of reveals, typically, like you brought up in the Shawshank Redemption, there's sort of this exposition that comes when you're sort of like, and here were all the hints we laid out. And in Shawshank, it was done a little better. Versus like, I don't know if you saw like the second Jurassic World where he's there explaining the whole like this plot with the little girl.
No, I didn't see it.
I didn't see it either.
I didn't.
But there was this really bad part where he spends like 6 times saying the same thing. Like, how do you like avoid like not doing that? Is it when you have to rely too much on the exposition? Is that bad foreshadowing, or is it possible that the exposition actually just sort of leads the crux of it? You kind of get the source of what I'm saying.
When you say exposition, what are you talking about?
So,
Like the
in
person-
Shawshank Redemption, okay, you have this big tunnel, and then you're seeing all the breadcrumbs.
Like at the end, how he did it?
Yeah, like explaining it, right? Like, this is what was happening, and this was the plot, so that, it's made obvious, versus some where all the hints are there, like in Harry Potter, where the Nicholas Flamel drops, but you only really get that reading it through again, right?
Yeah.
That's a good way to do it, and that's a bad way.
It's like an Ocean's 11 movie. They're like, and this is how we did everything.
It does depend on the
I love those
genre,
movies.
though. I think what your reader expects. Did you guys see the new Mission Impossible movie? Yes. Okay, thumbs up or down. If you liked it, thumbs up. If you didn't, thumbs down. Okay, everybody really liked it. Okay, I thought it was like totally obvious and I knew everything from the very beginning. But that's what people were in for. They were in for the action and they were in for the bait and switch. I think it depends on what your reader expects out of you. Like with romance, there aren't going to be a ton of surprises. Maybe unless it's Jerry Springer type romance. But for the most part, I don't think
do that.
Which is my favorite kind. It's so bad. But you know what I mean? I feel like it depends on what genre you're writing. It's the delivery and what it is you're going to choose. So in Shawshank, it worked to go back and show how it got to that point so the reader didn't shut the book and go, what? He got out of a tunnel? What just happened? But when it's a murder mystery, that those things should have been highlighted probably throughout the novel so that it gets to the end, you already know how they got to the you done it moment. So it really just depends on what you write. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that you could imagine a scenario with that film where they didn't go back and show you Andy dropping the rubble through his trousers, and they didn't show you him putting a different set of books in the safe. And you could have still stipulated the fact that some of that stuff happened when he goes into the bank at the end as the new Mr. Stevens and collects the money, and he has the I know way too much about this film, and he has the woman at the bank, send those books over to a journalist. He could have still done it in a flow of the narrative without having done that. But there was a little bit of, I think, what Frank did with that is, not that I know Frank, I sound like I'm friends with Frank.
Me and Frank.
But what he did with that is, I think you had such an emotional investment in these characters, because the movie's like 2 hours and 22 minutes long, that there was a little bit of, you wanted to know. Like, you wanted to be able to celebrate with him after all of the trial that he'd gone through, what had happened. And so those were little victories for you as the viewer to get to see how he accomplished this. So, and I don't think it's different for fiction. And so you could make the decision how much of that you want to put on the page and tell the reader versus not. I actually think it can go maybe even a step beyond just genre. There might be some story specific stuff there, like the tale you're telling inside genre. I mean, with the exception of romance, there's not very many successful romances that are going to end with the people not together, right? Or it's not a romance. But even inside, science fiction or fantasy or horror or any of the permutations of those, I think you could make writer decisions about how much of that to at the end. And some of that, I think, comes with the weight of the narrative. Like if you're reading an epic fantasy, there's an emotional investment in that. And so a little bit of time, this is why they're epilogues. There's a little bit of time for the reader to be able to just celebrate this journey they've been on, I think is okay. It's not as necessary or maybe even wanted if you've only been in the book for 80,000 words, because you've only been reading for 2 hours and the story's done.
I also think as far like being aware of what medium you're working with, so obviously something like a film or First BioShock is going to have a lot more leniency as far as going back and saying like, and this is how we did everything, because it's just a quick visual thing. It doesn't really feel like an info dump because it's 2 seconds. Whereas in a book, if you would say, so they dropped the necklace right here, and then this person came by and picked it up, like that's not going to be acceptable in a book. Maybe somebody wants to read that, I don't know. But I feel like one good way to keep from info dumping maybe, but still letting them know like how things happened is maybe that the character doesn't even figure it out all at once. It could be something that towards the end of the book, they're picking up bits and pieces of it. So you're still telling what happened, but it's not like a giant bomb of, hey, this is how we did it,
Yes.
So what do you guys think about trying to foreshadow a tragedy? Like for a romance, you start off at the beginning thinking this guy and this girl are going to get together, but by the end, that's not what happens. Or like an Armageddon type story where you've got your heroes that are off to save the planet, but they fail and now the planet is destroyed and all that's left are our heroes. That kind of twist.
Just don't even foreshadow it. Just break everybody in half right at the end. Just do it.
I mean, I think the best way to foreshadow a tragedy is to write your characters exactly the opposite, the relationship, so that when the tragedy happens, you really feel it. You wouldn't feel so bad about a character losing their significant other or their best friend if they weren't super affectionate and really close to that person, if they didn't have such a tight bond and you knew that by losing that person it was going to destroy your character. So if you're going to set up a tragedy like that, I have one in my first book, and that was published, and I knew that I was going to kill off this character, and so I had to show how close these 2 characters were. I really wanted it to hurt, I really wanted, so it was foreshadowed because I was so nice to them to begin with, and then I took it away. I know that's terrible, but that's a great way to do it.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't need this, I'm too mean.
No.
Yeah, one thing you can do is just have right at the beginning, when they're all happy, you can just say, little did they know that their affair was going to end tragically. Don't do that. Don't do that. Yes, back there. Yes.
So if you've got a character where you don't know where the other characters don't know, like, can we trust this guy, can we not? What are the pros and cons of having the reader be along with like, I don't know, and then like a split second before the characters figure it out, they figure it out as well, or is it having it be the train wreck you can't look away from?
So I've kind of done both. I've had stories where it's the one that I keep talking about, but I'm not going to tell you the title of because I don't want to spoil it for you. But I've had characters where, like, the reader has no idea. Like, there's not even a hint that this person could be bad, and all of a sudden, like, as the character figures it out, that's when you're like, oh, crap. Like, everything is terrible now. But then I'm working on a book right now where it's an alternating POV, and one character knows what's going on and the other one doesn't. And that's actually been fun because it's like there's foreshadowing that the reader's going to pick up on, but the character isn't because the reader knows and the character doesn't know that. So I think just kind of picking how you, if you want it to be a truth bomb where it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this just happened, then don't maybe necessarily let the reader in on it until the characters know. But yeah.
But that is at odds with the whole idea of foreshadowing. A little bit of that is so that it seems books are not real life. Like a big mistake I used to make in my early fiction is I would write it like I would see it happening in real life, and I would get comments from editors who say, I didn't know this was going to happen. There was no indication at all, and I said, that's what happens in life. When you show up and you get a diagnosis of cancer, it's not like, well, I had that precursor 13 years ago that said, too much Diet Coke, I have cancer now. So that's a thing. So what you're describing, where this train wreck you can't look away from because it springs on you from nowhere. It's not that can't work, but that would be an utter lack of foreshadowing. Like if you want the emotional payoff, or at least that sort of reader aha moment, then you'll have to have done something. It can be really subtle. I read a book by a woman where her foreshadowing was so subtle that even when I went back and reread it, I was like, are you sure this is foreshadowing? And that's okay, because that was what she wanted to do. But I think from what I heard you say, it sounds like that train wreck scenes, there's no foreshadowing. That's okay, but just acknowledge that there you made the writer choice not to use that technique.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
In the movie Sixth Sense, is it foreshadowing with all the red that he puts through the movie, the red sweater, the red doorknob, the lady in red at the end, or is that too subtle?
I think that's more symbolism than foreshadowing. Like, I think the foreshadowing is the scene where he's sitting in the living room with the mom, but they're not actually talking, and then she gets up and walks away. But, like, I feel like the red is more symbolic than anything, because you wouldn't, even after you've seen the movie, unless you went and, analyzed it, you wouldn't really put that together. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm an idiot. It's fine.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree. I actually watched the movie already knowing what the twist, for the first time already knowing what the twist was.
Me too.
Because a stupid reviewer had spoiled it because he thought he was being clever. But it was a very interesting film to watch, knowing what the twist was, because I could see everything that was being done, that he's not actually interacting. That he looks and sounds like he's interacting, but those people would be doing the exact same things if he wasn't there, except for the kid who can see him. If that spoiled the Sixth Sense for you, sorry, there's a statute of limitations on it. We have 1 minute left, so any final words from the panelists? You can promote an upcoming panel.
Tell us where to find you.
Right here.
What book you have.
Right here.
Don't drink Diet Coke.
Does that mean I'm okay because I drink regular Coke?
Yeah, you're fine.
Yes! Awesome. You can find me at another panel right now about creating a welcoming gaming community in the Cedar Room. And you can find me on YouTube making awkward game videos as Persephone Plasmids. There you go.
I would just say, in the not too distant future, the first book of Brandon and I's series will be out, so look for that.
Yay!
And I'm about to go to the Bain podcast recording, and people are invited to come to that and ask questions of me and Dave Butler. And I don't remember what room it is. Sycamore? Okay.
Bam. This guy's got your back.
So, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.